I almost feel as if I should start with an apology because uh, we've sang about the majesty of God and the mercy of God and our union with Christ, and now I want to take you to one of the darkest chapters in the Bible. And Job chapter 3, the existence of Job chapter 3, the fact that it is in our Bible, though, as dark of a chapter as it may be, is just further evidence of the fact that to experience depression, it's not in and of itself a sin. Sometimes our depression can be brought on by sin, of course, not always. Depression is very complex. Sometimes we can sin in the midst of our depression, but to be depressed in and of itself is not a sin, and Job chapter 3 is simply a reminder of that to us. And I was thinking this week, for those of you who are familiar with Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, there's a very vivid scene there. And if you haven't read Pilgrim's Progress, I'm not sure what you're waiting for. It's a classic. And anyways, Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory of the Christian life. And so Christian, the main character, is making his way from the city of destruction to the celestial city. He's on a journey, and early on to his heavenly destination, he's with a companion, and they fall into a swamp. They're not really paying attention, and suddenly they fall into a bog. It's called the bog of despondency, or the bog of despond. And here, this is sort of a metaphor for all the doubts, all the fears, all the temptations of sin collected in one place. And so they fall into this bog of despondency, trying to get out. And of course, the companion that's with Christian, he pulls himself out. He's like, I'm not going to go on this path to celestial city. And so he just sort of gives up and leaves. And Christian is left there in this bog of despondency. And he's got a burden on his back. And so he's sinking and sinking until someone named Help comes and pulls him out. Help is supposed to be representative of the Holy Spirit. He frees him from the pit. He puts him on solid ground. And then there's this conversation where Christian is saying, hey, why doesn't the king just fill up the bog? Mend it. Backfill it. So people don't fall into it anymore. So pilgrims on their journey don't get stuck. And Help says this. He says, the miry slough is such a place as cannot be mended. You have to go through it. And the king has taken steps, and he's placed it through the bog. Because you can't avoid it, but you've got to go through it. And I think that captures the reality of living in a fallen world. No matter how hard we try, no matter how spiritually mature we are, swamps of depression, despair are inevitable. They happen to all of us, and it's not because we failed somehow or because it's because it comes to all of us. All of us at some point or another experience the dark night of the soul. God has not promised us immunity from spiritual depression, and yet he has given us steps to get us through. Well, that's what we've been looking at the last few weeks. Today's our third of 4 messages, just thinking about this idea of spiritual depression. And my aim has been to sort of help us as we find ourselves in this place. But some of you may be thinking, I was actually very joyful until you started this series. I was doing great and you just pulled me down. Well, if you're in that spot, I want you to switch your thinking a little bit of how you can help others. In Romans 12:15, it says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And how can we actually do that if we don't know something about the pain that other people feel? I know we've come to this point over and over again, but the reality is that true believers in Christ can experience severe depression. I picked up a book a few weeks ago, and I don't agree with everything in it, but there's some helpful tidbits. It's a book called "I'm Not Supposed to Feel Like This," and it's a sort of a Christian perspective on depression. And listen to what the authors state. They said, "It is bad enough that I feel low or anxious, but on top of that, I feel guilty. For I ought not to feel low as a Christian. I feel that I ought to be able to cast my cares upon him, for he cares for me." 1 Peter 5:7. And yet somehow I can't. I wonder how many of you, amid depression, you feel a sense of guilt, a sense of shame. You think I shouldn't really feel this way. How can being a Christian and depression be compatible? I think if there is ever a biblical character to reassure us that you can be a genuine believer and struggle with this, it would be Job. So I want you to turn to Job chapter 3 today. And since we're sort of picking up in the third chapter, just let me set the context for you. In the beginning of Job, everything is as we think it should be. I mean, Job is a righteous, he's a God-fearing man. He has everything. He has lots of children. He's got wealth. He's got a wife. He's got good health, many possessions. And then in an instant, all of those things are stripped from him. They're taken from him. In chapter 1, all 10 of his children die. In chapter 2, he loses his health. And then to top it all off, in the midst of his pain and suffering, his wife shows contempt, tells him to curse God and die. And somehow Job says in chapter 1, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Amen. And then at the end of chapter 2, Job is just sitting there amidst all the destruction, his ruined home. He's sitting there with a group of friends. There's sort of this awkward silence. They're not very good friends, but they're friends, and they're there really not bringing any sort of comfort, and there's silence. And then Job, he breaks the silence in chapter 3 with a song of despair. And here is a song of despair that I think is a level many of us will never reach. Listen to what it says, Job chapter 3, verse 1. "After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, 'Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breast that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept, and then I would have been at rest, with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling. There the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly, and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes." Have you ever experienced something so dark? So profoundly depressing? As I began to study this week, my first question was, why again did I choose this passage? I mean, admittedly, here's a lament that it's difficult to know what to do with. But here's what helped me. I changed my question from why did I choose this to what would I say to someone in Job's position? Instead of just there being awkward silence, at times silence is good. What would I say? Well, here's what I would say. A few things based on the text. Number one, don't evaluate God based on your feelings. Don't evaluate God based on your feelings. In the first 10 verses, I mean, we have this window into the soul of Job and what he is experiencing. And here he curses the day of his birth. You look again at verse 3. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Well, that's quite the opposite of what we normally experience when we hear of a pregnancy or a new child being born. It's one of excitement, and it's universally taken as a sign of hope. It's a sign of life and blessing, but not for Job. And not only does he wish he was never born, he wishes that he was never conceived. Verse 6, he says that the day of his birth, he wishes it was wiped out from the calendar. In verse 7, he wishes the joy of that day would be taken away. And he even goes farther. In verse 8, he's imagining that professional curse makers are calling in the mythical sea creature Leviathan, who represents chaos and destruction, to destroy a part of the created order. I mean, and his choice of words, darkness, gloom, blackness, they all point to despair. Job curses the day of his birth because he says in verse 10 that trouble would be hidden from his eyes. You might wonder, is it okay for a believer to wish that? Is it okay for somebody who knows Christ, who follows the Lord, to say, I wish I had never been born? If your valley of despair is so deep to be able to say that, well, I know of one other place in the New Testament where something similar is said. Matthew 24:26. You don't have to turn there. This is that well-known verse where Jesus is speaking of Judas, and Judas, who would betray him, he says it would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Well, it's a very different context, isn't it, than what we find in Job. Judas was not a God-fearing man. Judas, while maybe giving an outward appearance of following the Lord, didn't actually follow the Lord. He wasn't a real disciple. He betrayed the Son of Man, and indeed anyone outside of Christ will be met with judgment. But Job is not Judas. Job he's far from perfect, but he's a God-fearing man. He walked in the way of walked in the way of the righteous. He worshiped God. And anyone in the Old Testament, for that matter, who feared God, who believed in the promises of God and walked by faith, should have never said, it would have been better if I had not been born. And any believer in the Lord Jesus Christ should never say, it would have been better if I had not been born. Now, I'm not convinced that Job blatantly sinned when he made that wish, but I do know this. When intrusive thoughts are not addressed, they can lead us down a road that we never intended to go down. We are told to take every thought captive to Christ. And CDC reports in 2022 alone, in the United States, over 49,000 Americans decided to take their life. That's actually a number that's been rising consistently, and yet we need not sink to that kind of despair. It is never, ever an answer for the Christian. because nothing happens to you randomly. I mean, we know that God has a purpose. And just consider the fact that if Job had never been born, if he had never existed, or perhaps if he had his wish and he was a stillborn child, you and I wouldn't have this very book of Job that helps us to understand suffering and despair as a means of understanding our own suffering and despair. I mean, God's purpose in our despondency can be for many reasons. Perhaps it reminds us of the broken world's groanings for redemption. It can perhaps remind us that we are weak, but yet in the strength that Christ gives us, he is glorified. Or perhaps it makes us long all the more for heaven, where the tears will be no more. Yet for whatever reason it may be, did you ever stop to think that maybe it isn't yours to figure out? The fact that you don't know why God allowed a certain hardship doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. Do you know what it means? It means you're not God. And so it's important to notice that Job cursed the day of his birth, but it's equally important, if not more important, to notice what Job didn't curse. And he didn't curse God. His cursing is not directed at him in any way. Make no mistake. I mean, Job is confused. He's overwhelmed. He has questions, but he does not evaluate God based on his feelings, nor should you or I. I mean, some might argue that Job cursing the day of his birth came very close to cursing God, but he didn't. And just because we feel that God has abandoned us, that doesn't mean that he has. And I would argue that Job, even in this deep valley of despair, doesn't give up. And here's why. Because the questions keep coming. In fact, that's the second thing I would say to somebody is ask questions, but defer to God's wisdom. Ask questions in the midst of your suffering and depression and despair, but defer to God's wisdom. The sheer number of times that Job asks God why indicates that God is actually very, very patient with us. I think far more than we realize. We see it a number of times throughout this chapter, but specifically, you look at verse 11 and 12. He says, "Why did I not die at birth and come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me? Or why the breasts that I should nurse?" Job thinks that, hey, if I had just died at birth, I'd be at rest right now. I wouldn't be experiencing this. Or verse 16, or why was I not hidden as a hidden stillborn child? One of the things we need to see and appreciate is that God allows Job to ask questions like these. Now, these may be misguided questions. These may not be the right questions. They may be questions that even at times sort of betray our stated beliefs, but yet God allows him to ask these questions. Some of you are familiar with Joni Eareckson Tada, who many years ago, when she was 17, she dove into the Chesapeake Bay. And she's come from a very athletic family, done a lot of swimming, and yet she misjudged how shallow it was. And she ended up becoming paralyzed from the shoulders down. Now, as you can imagine, as she was in rehabilitation and dealing with the permanent consequences of what happened, she was filled with questions and anger and depression, suicidal thoughts, even doubts about her faith in Jesus Christ. But the Lord never left her. In fact, to date, she has written over 40 books. She advocates for people with disabilities, and she really is a testimony to the fact that in God's economy, suffering is not meaningless. I want you to listen to what she said in one of her books. The book is called Secret Strength for Those Who Search. And she said this: "Make no mistake, Job's questions to God weren't of the polite Sunday school variety. They were pointed, sharp, and seemed at times on the border of blasphemy, tough, searching questions. Job's friends were horrified, and that to me is the comfort of the book of Job. What meant the most to me in my suffering was that God never condemns Job for his doubt and despair. God was even ready to take on the hard questions. But the answers weren't quite the ones Job was expecting. You see, Job is struggling, and at times we all struggle with this. Why do the godly suffer? Why do the righteous suffer? He can't understand that. But yet God allows him to ask question after question. And I think it's okay for us to, but yet deferring to God's wisdom. One of the most instructive aspects of Job's story is to realize that your perspective is horribly limited. Horribly limited. I mean, you could think of Job as a sort of a play, a theatrical performance, in a sense, with two stages. There's an upper stage and a lower stage. Here is Job on the lower stage, the stage of earth. And here he's seeing, experiencing, feeling things that are on that stage. And what he doesn't know is what's happening on the upper stage, the heavenly stage, that really takes place at the very beginning. If you remember, in chapter 1, we find out that there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also. And the Lord said to him, "Where have you come?" And well, Satan says, I've been going up and down the earth. And God says, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, blameless, an upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" And this is a key question. Satan said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." Well, and you know the rest. God allows Satan within parameters to test Job. God is completely in control. Did you notice that it is God who even suggested Job? He said, "Hey, have you considered my servant Job?" And here's Satan saying, "You know what? As long as you bless him, he will honor you. He will worship you. He will walk a certain way. Take it all away. He's going to curse you." That's what's being put to the test. In fact, Job's wife says, "Curse God and God, die." And so God allowed Satan to take everything from him to prove that Job did not just serve God because of his stuff, because of his blessings, but he served God because of God. Well, why do I bring this up? Well, it's not to say that every time we're experiencing hardship, there's a conversation in heaven. What it is meant to teach us, though, is that we know very little sometimes of what's really going on. Job is unaware of this. And yet we see that God is in control. And God is not threatened by our questions. You might find that even just giving voice to your struggles, voice to the things that you're dealing with, brings a measure of healing to your soul. And so when we pray and we ask God questions like, why is this happening? Why are things turning out like this? Why couldn't things be different? Here's what I would encourage you to do. Couple that with Romans 11:33 through 35. Oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? Right? We defer to God's wisdom. Third thing. That's what I would say to someone in the valley. Acknowledge God's presence in your pain. Acknowledge God's presence in your pain. When you look at verses 20 through 26, it's not like some portions of the Bible where there's despair, and then like things start to turn up. For Job, it's just sort of despair, kind of some more despair. And in verses 20 through 26, he begins to question the futility of life. what he sees as sort of the meaninglessness of life at this point. He questions the creation of the world. He sighs. Every time he looks back at the past, he's filled with regret and sorrow. And not only does he wonder why he had to be born, he laments the birth of everybody who's miserable. The phrase bitter in soul in verse 20 is actually in the original. It's in the plural. This may not always seem the most comforting, but you're not alone in suffering. And then I think verse 26 is a good summary of all that Job is thinking and feeling. He says, I'm not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. See, all he can see is trouble. No quiet, no rest, no ease. And you might wonder, so where's the glimmer of hope? Right? Somebody once said there's a silver lining in every cloud. I don't know who made that up, but you might be saying, hey, where's the hope in this? Where's the gospel of this? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Will things ever lift? And strangely, there is some hope in the restlessness of Job. And I think it's because his restless state forces him to struggle with the authenticity of his faith. It really makes him question the things that he professes to believe. And then even though Job feels God's absence, he can't ignore God. Look at verse 20. Why is light given to him who is in misery and life to the bitter in soul? Now, Job doesn't mention God's name in that verse, but it's implied when he uses the word given. It's strikingly similar to what he said in 121. He gives and takes away. Again, in verse 23, it implies that life is given by God. And so here's what's going on with Job. As much as he can't see God's hand or feel God's presence, he realizes he has to deal with God. C.S. Lewis wrote a reflection when his wife died. It was called A Grief Observed. He asked the question in his bereavement, where is God? And listen to his answer. He said, this is one of the most disquieting symptoms, when you're happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence becomes. At least that's what it seemed to him in those moments. And Job knows a suffering just as deep, if not deeper, and yet at the same time he can't ignore God. He sees God's hand in his suffering. When you read the whole book of Job, you realize that he actually longs to see God. He talks about seeing God, and yet he does not see him till the end. And even though that's true, when he gets to the end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, and he's sitting in an ash heap, the reality is that God is there. God knew the extent of the pain that he was feeling. God knew all the circumstances, and he was listening to the conversations. He knew exactly what was happening. He was there every single step of the way. And the reality is, when you and I go through the dark night of the soul, we might think he's removed, but he's not removed. And sometimes we don't realize this until we get to the other side. There are times when we never fully understand the whys. And I don't know why, but for some reason, we always assume that God intends for us to discover the details of his plan, right? We talk about discovering God's will, and we kind of have this idea at times that, hey, we need to know exactly everything that God is doing. It's got to be clearly laid out for us, and we've got to go looking for it. And just because God does not share his plan with you or me, doesn't mean he doesn't have one. Job actually teaches us that in his God's sovereignty, the Lord may allow terrible things to happen to you, and you may never know why. In fact, nowhere do I see that the events of chapter 1 and 2, where there's this conversation on the heavenly stage, were ever disclosed to Job. Well, time doesn't permit us to go through the pages of Job this morning all the way to the end. Suffice to say, there's an abundance of lament in the following chapters describing his despair. And yet, when we come to chapter 19, in the midst of all this, Job makes one of the most hopeful statements one of the most triumphant statements that we could come across. Listen to what he says. Verses 25 and 26 and 27. For I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the last he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me. Did you see what was going on there? Job is not saying, hey, I can hope now because all of my questions have been answered. Hey, everything's better now because I have a better idea of what's going on. No, he doesn't say that at all. He cries out in the midst of his suffering. He says, I still have hope. I have a Redeemer. The word Redeemer is used in Ruth to describe the champion of the oppressed. It's used in Exodus to describe the deliverer of the captives. It's used in Proverbs to describe the defender of the weak. And Job says, I too have a Redeemer. He says he'll deliver me. And so no matter how dark your situation may seem, no matter how painful it might be, God is infinitely wise and perfectly worthy of your trust. Timothy Keller is an author, pastor, passed away this past year. He wrote a lot of books on he wrote a lot of good books, but he wrote some books on suffering and even on death. And then he got pancreatic cancer. He spent his whole life talking about these things and counseling others to put their hope in the gospel. And then he's faced with a terminal illness, and his faith in God began to be stretched and challenged in ways that it hadn't before. It began to grow in ways that he hadn't before. He wrote an article before he died for The Atlantic. I want you to listen to what he says. He says, but if there is a God great enough to merit your anger over the suffering you witness or endure, then there is a God great enough to have reasons for allowing it that you can't detect. It is not logical to believe in an infinite God and still be convinced that you can tally the sums of good and evil as he does, or to grow angry that he doesn't always see things your way. He said, when I got my cancer diagnosis, I had to look not only at my professed beliefs, but also at my actual understanding of God. Had it been shaped by my culture? Had I been slipping unconsciously into the supposition that God lived for me rather than I for him? That life should go well for me? That I knew better than God does how things should go? The answer was yes, to some degree. But listen to what he says. He said, I found that to embrace God's greatness, to say thy will be done, was painful at first, and then perhaps counterintuitively liberating, profoundly liberating. Job 3 ends in silence. I mean, if you're Job's friends and you heard this, you'd be thinking, what do I say? They don't say anything for a while. And after everything, how would you respond? Well, this points us to something greater. His loneliness foreshadows a greater loneliness. His darkness anticipates a deeper darkness. 2,000 years ago, another blameless believer was in deep darkness, and he said, in the face of death, thy will be done. He hung on a cross. He gave his life. Job's darkness of soul foreshadows the darkness of the cross. And there, and only there, lies the hope of rescue. We may not understand why. It may not be intended for us to understand why. But it's there.